Hello and welcome to this AeroTime exclusive interview. My name is Richard Stephenson and I am delighted to be here to interview a true aviation professional with some amazing stories to share. Pat Cafferky is Special Missions B727 Captain and head of the counter pollution team at 2XL Aviation. Founded in 2005 by two Royal Air Force pilots, 2XL has grown from 5 people and 4 aerobatic aircraft to more than 400 people and a fleet of 28 aircraft. Pat has been flying since 1983 and now leads the company's work with Oil Spill Response Limited, the world's largest international industry-funded membership organization. He studied nautical science and marine navigation at the Plymouth School of Maritime Studies and started off as a deck cadet and acting third officer at BP Shipping. After conquering the waters, Pat moved to the skies and he's never looked back. Pat, welcome to AeroTime. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Richard, it's an absolute pleasure to be with you on AeroTime. And as you can see, I'm joining you from a simulator complex down near Gatwick Airport.
Well, thank you very much for being here. And actually, being in a simulator complex very near Gatwick is the perfect place to start our discussion today, because I actually want to talk about the aircraft you're now flying and the amazing job that you are doing. But before we do that, I just quickly want to take you right back to the start and ask you about your journey to the cockpit. How did you become a pilot?
Gosh, it's an interesting story. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it. When I was 16, as you alluded to, I joined the Merchant Navy and worked for BP Shipping. Got my third mate certificate in marine navigation. And then back in 1982, BP underwent quite a dramatic reduction in their fleet size. As a result, I was made redundant. And it was around the time of Gizzard Job and Yosser Hughes and the boys from the Black Stuff, if you remember. Fairly bleak times for a lot of people. And I just opened a newspaper, saw an article with a little picture of a Jaguar aircraft on it, cut it out, sent it away to Biggin Hill, and before I knew it, I was in the Royal Air Force and training to become a pilot. So a very lucky story in a lot of ways, but I'd like to say I took my opportunity at the time and never looked back. So started flying, as you alluded to, in '83, and then have just been incredibly fortunate to have such a brilliant career, flying a number of amazing aircraft.
And that continues today, of course. You're now a captain with 2XL, where you head the counter pollution team. This really is a fascinating role. And I've been looking through some photography. I've been reading some reports about the kind of things that you do. But how would you sum it up for our viewers?
The Boeing 727 is iconic in its own right. Anybody you talk to who of that era who flew it as a passenger airliner or a cargo airliner will tell stories of how much they love the aircraft, and I can absolutely see why. In my limited time on the aircraft, I've been flying it now for 5 years. I've come to love it, and having spent 17 years in the airlines prior to the Boeing 727 flying charter passengers, I can see a significant difference. The aircraft is incredibly responsive. It's got a wonderful feel to it. You feel very connected to the flying control surfaces. And from our point of view, we've found it a delight to operate in the low-level environment that we have to employ for the oil spill response role. I've got a team of dedicated professionals who work for me, and the 15 of us who form 5 crews based out of Doncaster, as you alluded to earlier on, have nothing but praise for what is an iconic aircraft, but in very much a new and complex role.
And this sort of the love affair with the 727 doesn't really start or finish there, does it? Because I understand that you actually created, you built, and you certified the new TERA system for the 727. You did all of this in-house. But how do you actually go about that kind of system development for that kind of aircraft? And tell us a bit more about exactly what that system does.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a great story as well. 2XL, as you again said earlier on, it started from fairly humble beginnings with 2 aircraft, 5 people, and then the aerobatic team forming very quickly after that. Since then, we've come by the strapline of doing difficult things well. And that's really important that we understand that 2XL as an aviation services provider have taken on a number of projects over the years, none greater than the TERA, that's the name for the system we adapted and built and placed in the back of the 727. But that sits alongside a whole host of other activities. But the beauty of 2XL is that we have the capability not just to design and then build the system, we can then fit it to the aircraft. And so it's a one-stop shop for what has become the world-leading spray system. It's incredibly advanced in technology. It has a number of features which are completely unique. A good example being that the tanks within TERSAs that carry dispersant allow us to transit globally at flight level 360, but then drop into low level and spray without having to reconfigure the aircraft in any way, shape or form. So a really, really impressive and capable system in an aircraft that, whilst iconic, is still incredibly relevant today.
And this is a really good introduction to the kind of specialist capability that you guys have and that you've created with your teams. And I think it'd be really interesting to know just a little bit more about that specialist capability that you've built up and you've developed within 2XL, and how your crews actually go about doing all of the training to ensure that those essential services that you provide can be delivered in a timely fashion for your customers when they're needed.
It's, again, a great question. Put yourself in the shoes of our Civil Aviation Authority flight ops inspector. When you knock on his door approximately 8 years ago and say, just to let you know, we've been asked to design, build, certify, crew, train and operate a Boeing 727, which at the time wasn't even operating within Europe, was only operating over under the FAA. And at the time, 2XL had only operated, the largest aircraft was a King Air. So after the flight ops inspector sat down and probably drank a cold cup of water just to calm his nerves, we went about convincing the authority and in particular, obviously, the design capability side of the CAA, that 2XL had the expertise in-house to do this. We, of course, didn't do it alone. We partnered with a number of industry bodies along the way. We created a system that, as I alluded to, is unique from the literary drawing board to putting it into the aircraft. That took about 18 months. And again, that's unparalleled in aviation production. If you went to probably one of the larger design authorities within aviation, this type of complex project would take tens of years in some circumstances. But 2XL prided itself on being reactive and being able to produce very, very highly technical solutions in relatively short timescales, and then support them in service as well. So that's a technical aspect, but also I think it's important that the flight ops inspector had to feel comfortable about who was going to be flying the aircraft. And so right from the outset, we recognized that the skill set required to operate the 727 would require probably ex-military personnel. Not across the board, because as I'm only too aware, having spent half my time in civil aviation and half in military aviation, there are some amazing pilots who have never been in the military, but that understanding and situational awareness of the low-level environment was pretty important. So in particular, the left-hand seat pilots at those early stages were all ex-military, low-level fast jet pilots, like myself, and they helped design the procedures and processes amongst the three-man crew, because obviously a 727 has those unicorns in terms of flight engineers. Nowhere else found apart from Boeing 707s, perhaps the AWACS style aircraft, which are still operating. And therefore, the combination of a low-level capable left-hand seat pilot and commander, the first officer, again, predominantly ex-military, and then a flight engineer acting as the classic synergy of 1 + 1 + 1 equals more than the sum of their parts, makes it a very safe and very measured role. And actually, those people who observe it, and we encourage people to come and observe it, are struck by just how calm the aircraft is, because we'll talk about the parameters in a minute, but we do fly it at very low levels.
I mean, I can actually imagine, as a former director of the CAA myself, I can imagine those flight ops people and their reaction. But I also know that, I mean, the CAA is always looking at innovation, and it's always looking to see how it can really support the industry to progress with these things. So, you know, I can imagine that it may well have been a tense potentially, but also a challenging assignment for that flight ops inspector. But I'm quite sure they also would have been really intrigued by this and very keen to try and move it forward because of the innovation and the opportunities that clearly stem from this kind of development.
Yeah, I agree, Richard. You know, and looking back, you know, we were incredibly fortunate. We had 2 or 3 flight ops inspectors over that period, and they were nothing but supportive. As you've alluded to, that, you know, their role, or one of their roles, is to support UK industry, and this was a great opportunity, you know, to have a world-leading system, UK designed and built by a UK-based company, placed into, as I say, such a reliable platform as 727, in the end gave them very limited issues for concern. And that 3-man crew, I'd like to go back to that, if you don't mind, because I think the parameters are worth understanding. And I know you'll be sharing some footage of this, but the aircraft is designed to deploy the dispersant material at 150 feet over the sea. And approximately 150 knots as well. So to that end, we extend some of the aircraft's flap system, flap 15. We use the 3-man crew in specific roles. So the commander is at the controls of the aircraft, manually flying, no autopilot down at that height. The first officer in the right-hand seat controls the speed by modulating the number 2 engine, which is, of course, the centerline engine on the 727, which means there's no element of yawing as the aircraft pod engines are left and right. We simply fix those at a steady power setting and use that number 2 engine to control the speed. And then finally, the flight engineer manages the dispersant system. So he selects the tanks, ensures the correct flow rate, but his secondary role is forward-looking to almost metronomically call out the height. So he will say in my ear, 150, 150. And what he's indicating is that the aircraft is steady at 150 feet. And he's also checking the dispersant system to make sure that we're deploying the dispersant in the right quantities, because that in itself is quite a science. And particularly with the environmental concerns over dispersant, we're very aware of our responsibilities there.
And I mean, that is another big challenge, isn't it, for the kind of work that you're doing, that, you know, there's no doubt that we are facing more and more environmental challenges. And there's no doubt that what you're doing is trying to bring aviation into those environmental challenges to help us tackle some of these threats in the future. But how exactly does this technology help us to tackle those threats?
Well, first and foremost, it's worth thinking about the fairly poor history that dispersants may have in some people's eyes. Those of us old enough to remember, and perhaps who, like myself, used to holiday in the Southwest with my parents, will remember the Torrey Canyon incident. I think I was 9 years old when that happened. And at the time, the understanding of how dispersants worked and reacted with the environment was very limited. In fact, there are some fairly iconic photographs of, I think, policemen and firemen with their caps on, with hoses spraying dispersant in my own beautiful harbour down back in Cornwall of Porthleven, and completely, you know, ruining the marine environment for a number of years afterwards. So with that as a background, it's been really important that we have taken the use of dispersants into the modern environmentally aware arena. To that end, the TERA system is designed to spray dispersant at an incredibly controlled rate, even down to ensuring that the droplet size that comes out of the boom at the back of the aircraft is within a 10% of the approved international micron size for those droplets. Too large, and they will pool, and then they won't be effective against the oil spill. Too small, and they'll shatter, and they'll never reach the ground. They'll move into the atmosphere. The dispersant itself lands on the oil and takes the oil down into the water column. So there's no magic dust that turns the oil into something which is environmentally friendly. We simply put it back where it originally came from, which is down to the surface, the subsurface in the sea. So that's really important, that we are seen to deploy dispersant in a very ecological and environmentally friendly manner. And we're monitored in that, not only by our client, Oil Spill Response, who have a technical task specialist on the aircraft, auditing exactly where we place the dispersant, but we have our own methods of making sure that the dispersant is appropriately used and logged at all times. And interesting, that was very much the case back in Macondo, when a number of operators found themselves facing litigation because they couldn't justify how they had spread dispersant. So we've moved on from that, and now we provide what we think is the world-leading service.
So, I mean, as an industry, aviation is sometimes seen as being very much on the wrong side of the environmental debate. But the work that you're doing is crucial in tackling potential environmental catastrophes. So how does 2XL actually approach that environmental and sustainability debate?
Yeah, it's really important. And what we're finding is that there are a number of contracts which we're tendering for with either industry or government. And increasingly, it's important that a business like ourselves have robust environmental credentials. In order to simply tender, we have to demonstrate our own internal environmental capabilities from a point of view of recycling, just like any business would. But as you allude to, aviation has an even greater responsibility. So looking at use of synthetic technology for training is a good example. So we can be in a simulated complex as I am today. We can train our pilots to an extent that we've not been able to do before, which then reduces the amount of emissions we need to do through flying the aircraft themselves. So although my aircraft are ready, 365 days a year, and 24 hours a day, the reality is I achieve the bulk of my training in a simulator device. We obviously try and employ environmentally friendly aircraft. The 727 is no spring chicken. It's been around for a long time, and we're only keenly aware of the effect of noise pollution, and therefore we only operate into sites that are significantly away from population. And of course, one of the benefits of our role is that we're predominantly in coastal locations, predominantly where there are large oil fields. And to that end, we tend to find ourselves not being, let's say, a local nuisance to the population. And whilst noise is only one aspect, obviously fuel burn is another, and the ability to train in these synthetic devices really helps us keep that footprint as small as possible.
Of course, you always have to take things like noise pollution into account, and there are huge swathes of the population across the world who really object to that kind of noise pollution. But I also know that there are a lot of our viewers and a lot of our AeroTime community who love that kind of noise and who love to hear the roar of the aircraft going over their head. And I know that there's lots of people watching today who would have been amazed to see the aerial photography sortie that you led recently, and actually which led to us having this conversation today. And there were 3 aircraft that were used for that aerial photography sortie. I believe it was the 727 was involved, the Piper Navajo, and an extra 300. And of course, the logistics for that kind of formation flying are incredibly complex, to say the very least. So how did you go about planning and executing that particular event? And what was the thinking behind it?
First of all, it was a privilege to be involved in it. Yeah, I always used to love formation flying when I was in the military, and being in the hands of, as I was, I literally oversaw the management of the 727 cockpit with the ex-Tornado display pilot, a lovely chap called Mike Baverstock. I was in company with a ex-Red Arrow in the form of Andy Evans, flying the PA-31, and we were then being circled by the blade pilot, which was Ben Murphy, again another ex-Red Arrow. So first of all, you make sure you're in good hands. I think that's really key. Safety is obviously the key, and we were incredibly lucky that we had access to that group of individuals. And 2XL quite often obviously is involved with formation flying, whether it's within the blades themselves or with other aircraft, and the dissimilar nature of the formation presents its own challenges. So from a safety point of view, we're very interested in wake turbulence, for example, jet wash behind the aircraft. If inadvertently the PA-31 found itself directly behind the Boeing 727, then it would be a difficult situation for Andy to have handled. So avoiding those areas of known wake vortices and turbulence is really important. And then there's a dissimilar aspect as well, that the 727 is comfortable flying at 150 knots, but we're pushing up towards the top of the performance envelope for the PA-31 and indeed for the blade as well. So ensuring that the maneuvers we do allow the aircraft to position themselves safely and also maintain the appropriate formation is important. Next is the airspace. Where do you physically go in the UK to do this? Well, first and foremost, we avoid doing this over land, and not just for the noise, but also because we think it would be inappropriate to do that. And of course, our role is oversea anyway. So the photography which came out of that mixed formation is predominantly shot off the coast of East Yorkshire in the environment of Flamborough Head, and obviously clear of cloud and anything that may cause disruption to the formation. So once the environment and the aircraft and the pilots are fixed and the safety aspects are hammered home to everybody, then we're in a good place to take the formation forward. And then it's keeping the plan as simple as possible. And interestingly, the photographer for that whole mission was a chap called Ian Black. And Blackie, as we all know him, was from the Royal Air Force days, always interested in aerial photography. And his knowledge and experience that he brought to the formation were also very useful. So the key there was you listen to everybody. We talked to air traffic control, we talked to our ground crews, we talked to the whole of the formation, give everybody a vote to make it as safe as possible, and use a system which is now very prevalent in aviation, which is threat error management. So these are the threats, this is what the errors might be, how are we going to mitigate those if they become a problem on the day? And as it turned out, that preparation worked incredibly well, and the formation went ahead without a hitch.
Now, when you think about some of the special missions that you're now leading, you think about the principles behind that. You think about how you need to organise those things, the logistical complexity of all of this, and you talk about making sure you're in good hands, which clearly, on this day, you clearly were. Sounds like you had an amazing crew around you, but that teamwork aspect must be incredibly important, because for every pilot in the sky, there is a huge army of people on the ground making sure that everything works effectively, and of course, as you said, safely. Safety is always the #1 priority for anything like this. But I understand you had a bit of I think it was a 6-month planning window, and then of course, right at the last minute, you have to make sure that you also have good weather. So getting that teamwork together, making sure everything is safe, planning for 6 months, waiting for the sun to shine. I mean, you're relying on an awful lot to come together at the same time to make this even possible.
We are, and I think we're quite lucky. I used the phrase "one-stop shop" earlier on. 2XL, we're never unique. There's always somebody snapping at your heels. But I feel that 2XL is ideally placed to undertake these kind of special missions. And just sort of going off track slightly for a second, you'll probably be aware that special missions is predominantly 2 aspects. It's counter pollution, but it's also a surveillance role as well. And the contracts we have with the Maritime Coast Guard Agency to provide search and rescue cover really do require a similar teamwork, but that's on a daily basis. So, my 6 months preparation, finding the weather window, getting the right team together, yes, was significant. But what we have to realize as well, that there are other parts of 2XL Aviation who are doing that on a daily basis, whether it's responding to a lone yachtsman with an injury 250 miles off the southwest approaches in a King Air, to ensure that the helicopter has the endurance to go and pick him off that yacht without having to search. That's an incredibly complex task in its own right. And just to think about how that happens, well, that aircraft has to have the right equipment. That equipment has to be serviced. Our engineers have to be incredibly knowledgeable in how they prepare the airborne radar, the infrared cameras, the turrets on the front of the aircraft. So we are incredibly reliant on that team. The ramp staff have to pull it out, get it refueled, get it prepared. That there is a significant group effort to achieve any one of our tasks. And yet we're very lucky to be in a business that's doing that on a daily basis.
And I guess when you finish any one of these special missions or any one of the tasks that you are referring to, you have to look back, you have to evaluate, you have to think about what went well, maybe what didn't go so well, what you can learn for the future. But thinking about this particular mission that we're talking about today, I mean, when you look at the results from that mission and you look at the video footage, you look at the photography, I mean, it's pretty amazing. There's some pretty amazing stuff in there. And, there must be some parts of this that really inspire you because there are a number of challenges with aerial photography. But when you look at those results, what really inspires you about what has been achieved here?
I'm going to say something that might sound a bit trite here, and I don't I don't mean to sound trite, but I spent 17 years in the airlines and I had a wonderful time. I flew for a major charter operator. I just loved every moment of it. But when the time is right to move on. And I think the word I use, and this is perhaps a slightly light-hearted element to this, is I wanted some fun out of aviation again. I was approached by one of the founding members of the business to come and join 2XL 5 years ago. And I recognized straight away from the way it was pitched to me that this was a group of individuals who were ready to take on the world, but do it with a smile on their face. And I have thrived in that community. I can't speak highly enough about how much fun we have in 2XL. And it's fun because it's challenging. It's fun because it reminds me of the military and the challenges we placed ourselves under. And therefore, flights like the one we did for the air-to-air photography are just an example of that. Going to Farnborough and displaying the 727 to the general public, going on numerous overseas detachments on behalf of our client, Oil Spill Response Limited, to ensure that their clients have the surety that we can respond. Going down to West Africa, going around Europe, going to the Middle East. All these deployments have just given everyone confidence that we can achieve our role, but at the same time, we've done it with a smile on our face. And as you've alluded to earlier on, always listening to our clients to make sure we're delivering what they want. And perhaps equally importantly, listening internally to what how we can make things better each time we do it, so that it's just easier all around, and I hate to say it, more fun as a result.
Well, you talk about having more fun, and I think it's really important in anyone's role, anyone's job, to have fun and to be focused on having fun. And I've always believed that in aviation, especially in the role of a pilot, you can have a lot of fun. And I would imagine that flying at 150 feet over the sea, I mean, it's pretty exhilarating. I remember I was very fortunate. I was very lucky to go flying with the RAF, and I went in a Hawk over the Lake District, and we did some low-level flying there. And I must admit, I'm not entirely sure my stomach was made for it, but I did it, and I would do it all again tomorrow. But bringing something like this together is a huge task. It's a huge undertaking. But you've been a pilot with the RAF, you've worked in the airlines, you're now doing this. You must have some pretty memorable experiences. So what are your favorite stories from the cockpit?
Oh gosh, that's a tricky one. What always does come to mind, actually, and it'd be very easy to wax lyrical about the single seat role of the Jaguar, which I dearly love flying that aircraft. But I was incredibly fortunate for my second tour in the military to be posted overseas. And I went to the United States Air Force and flew recce F4s. So the Phantom RF-4C, I flew it out of Bergstrom Air Force Base in Texas. And it was my first introduction to flying with a crew member. So rather like now I have obviously a co-pilot and a flight engineer. Well, this was my first introduction to relying on somebody else in the cockpit to work on my behalf. And I had a most amazing WISO, which is a weapons system operator, who was sitting behind me, far more knowledgeable about the Phantom than I was. And to be honest, far better pilot of the Phantom, because the aircraft was double sticked, so they could fly from the rear seat as well. And Doug, my back seater, was just a brilliant pilot in his own right. One time we took the aircraft to Nellis Air Force Base, to the red flag exercise, which probably a lot of your listeners and viewers will know about. That exercise combines about 120 to 150 aircraft pitted against each other as sort of blue air and red air, simulating all kinds of wartime threats, with surface-to-air missile systems trying to simulate shooting you down. And myself and Doug, as the RF-4 crew, led, so planned, briefed, led, and then debriefed a mission there. And I think there's a highlight of my career when we went into that debrief, knowing that for that one day we'd achieved all our aims. We controlled the tankers, the airborne assets that were acting as air defense, the bombing aircraft, the reconnaissance aircraft, in that amazing simulated environment. But flying for real over the desert in Nevada, that was quite a high point in my career. And I look back with incredible fondness on America, flying low level through West Texas, flying through the Scottish Highlands in the Jaguar, taking the aircraft down to Oman, doing laser guided bomb trials, prepping the aircraft for the Gulf War, all kinds of highs, and an overwhelming feeling of just being incredibly privileged and fortunate to have sort of landed on my feet. I think they call it the look of the Irish, Richard. I'm not sure.
Well, you've just actually answered another question for me, which I wasn't going to raise in this interview, but I've done quite a bit of flying out of Palm Springs. Okay. And whichever direction you go from Palm Springs, you find restricted airspace very, very quickly. And I think you've just explained it, because you've just taken us on a bit of a whistle-stop tour across most of the south of the United States in your military aircraft. So maybe next time I'm flying my Cessna 172 around, I'll wave to you as you whiz past in something a lot faster than that. But I mean, you've talked about a number of special missions that you've taken on in various forms, in various roles that you've had. And I think that one of the things that really strikes me is that with any kind of special mission, whether it was in your forces days or whether it's today, that there really needs to be the bringing together of the right capabilities, the right people, the right team around you, so that you can bring those concepts to life. And I'd just be really interested to know, what's the most challenging brief you've taken on so far as one of those kind of special missions that you've talked about?
I think if we bring it back to the present and talk about the 727, we've had the opportunity to take the aircraft not quite around the world, but to a number of continents now, and particularly as we predominantly train in the UK. It's very easy to become lax in the way you approach multi-aircraft formation. So obviously imagine now the scenario over a live oil spill. Obviously we're going to have the dispersant aircraft. It's likely that we'll have surveillance aircraft. Increasingly now we're finding that UAVs, unmanned air vehicles, will be in the air as well. There's likely to be media, so that's helicopters. And so what we're trying to do is understand now what that means for a deconfliction piece. So what I found was that when we did take the aircraft out of Europe, then you introduced a language barrier, you introduced different standard operating procedures. So making sure that you have a predominantly safe environment in which to operate is key. And so the biggest challenge for me, and I prefer not to sort of talk about locales, but the biggest challenge for me was just ensuring that all the aviators involved in putting hardware into the sky over that spill, inbound and outbound from that spill, did so in a safe fashion. And for some reason, and maybe it's 2XL, maybe it's the size of the Boeing 727, come the day in the briefing room or the planning phase, everyone looks to the 727 to come up with the solutions, which is great because we've got a team of 3. We've probably got that spare capacity. Undeniably, the vast majority of my team have got the ability. So we will come up with a plan that's safe, based on industry standards. And those are standards that we create ourselves and then spread throughout the industry. So that's probably been the biggest, organizational challenge, to make sure that those operations are run smoothly and safely when you're dealing with other nationals in their own aircraft and sometimes in their own airspace as well.
Well, Pat, we've talked a lot about challenges. We've talked a lot about complexity of these kind of operations. But just to finish on, I want to turn to something different. Not challenges, not complexity, but actually achievement. I'd like to know what you think or what you consider to be your biggest achievement in this role so far, and actually what you want to go on to achieve in the future.
One of the biggest achievements I think we've managed to do is and it may sound trivial, and I apologize if it does. I've got a 25-year-old first officer flying the 727. He is a phenomenon. In a different world, he would have joined the Royal Air Force and flown Harriers or whatever. But this young man is a truly, truly capable and accomplished pilot. He's flown Tiger Moths in the past. He was a flight instructor. It would be incredibly wrong to say he was plucked from obscurity, but on spec, he applied to 2XL to fly the Navajo. We watched him on the Navajo for about 6 months, and it was obvious that he was talented. I then approached the director of flight operations at 2XL and asked to put him through a simulated competency check. We put him into a Boeing 737, which you're probably aware is one of the trickier airliners to fly. And he came through that with flying colors. He is probably the youngest 727 pilot in the world. He is probably one of the most capable people in the world. He knows the job inside out. He'll never have the hours to move across to the left-hand seat, but boy, he's got an amazing future ahead of him. I think it sounds like maybe a Finnish achievement, but for the system to be capable of putting him into that cockpit and for us to be 100% comfortable that he is now our go-to guy as a first officer, age 25, I think that speaks volumes for not just 2XL, but also, our recruitment policy as well. So that's one of my real highlights, if I'm honest. Sorry, maybe not quite as dramatic as perhaps it should have been, but that's wonderful to be able to offer that opportunity.
I think it's a great story, and I think it's a great answer to the question, because one of the things that we're trying to do here at AeroTime is to encourage the next generation of aviators. And we've been doing a lot of work. We've been running campaigns. We've been running campaigns about pilots, about women in aviation. We've been running another campaign about My COVID Story, which is telling the stories of people from across aviation and how they've managed the challenges of the last year or so. So I think it's a great answer, and I actually don't think you could have given a better answer. There is nothing better than encouraging the next generation to come through and to help them on their career journey. And I'm sure that 25-year-old will not only thank you for everything that you're doing for them, but also I think they might thank you when we reach out to them and ask them to be the next person to be interviewed on AeroTime about their experiences as a young pilot today. So, thank you for that answer, and thank you for what you're doing there. But look, Pat, unfortunately, that brings us to the end of this exclusive AeroTime interview today. I've really enjoyed speaking to you. It's been great to speak to you. And I know that there will be many people across our industry who will find this interview encouraging and inspiring, and of course, interesting. So thank you for taking the time. It's been a fascinating tour of your career, your work today. And I really want to wish you and all the team at 2XL all the best for the future. And I hope that we can stay in touch and, you know, keep up to date with the work that you're doing. And who knows, maybe in the future, we can talk again about the next special missions that you guys will be running, because I really do think that they're fascinating. And I know that our viewers will think that too. So that unfortunately brings us to the end of this exclusive AeroTime interview. I want to thank you all for joining us. And especially, Pat, thank you to you and the team at 2XL. My name is Richard Stephenson, and you've been watching AeroTime. Goodbye.